During the U.S. expansion in the mid-1800s, many debates arose when the American government granted increasing permission to white settlers to claim land and resources already belonging to indigenous tribes in northern Colorado. The U.S. government offered what it considered a diplomatic solution in the form of the Treaty of Fort Laramie. This promised indigenous tribes protection of their natural resources as long as they would allow white migrants to pass through their lands without conflict. The government failed to keep its promise of protection, leading ultimately to a historical through-line of cultural ruination. So, how did the American government and white settlers invade and begin their betrayal against the indigenous people? There had always been tension between indigenous people and American settlers in this area. Specifically, the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes lived on land in what is now known as northern Colorado and southern Wyoming. Debates between these tribes and settlers began during the Romantic era, when the U.S. started its westward expansion. One main cause for this expansion was the discovery of gold in California. Gold was discovered near Coloma on January 24, 1848, by a man named James W. Marshall. When this information was spread across the U.S. and other parts of the world, it sent over 300,000 white settlers traveling west in hopes of finding their own riches in gold. Around half of them came by sea, and the other half traveled by horse, by wagons, and by foot as they made their treacherous journeys across the U.S.-California Trail. In northern Colorado and southern Wyoming region, the U.S.-California Trail ran along the North Platte River that bordered parts of land that the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes had previously claimed. As white settlers began making their way through Wyoming towards California, they disrupted the daily lives of the indigenous people.
They started forcing us, demanding that they come through. And from that time on, we were always targets.
When white settlers traveled through these lands without care, overtaking their natural resources such as overhunting bison and creating their own trails, the indigenous people were rightfully angry. In addition, the settlers spread smallpox and cholera to the Cheyenne tribe during this time, resulting in the cholera and smallpox epidemic of 1849. This killed nearly half of the Cheyenne tribe. The population of white settlers on indigenous land began to increase drastically, resulting in arguing and battling with the native tribes, where they would invade each other's camps and start brutal attacks that ended oftentimes in injury or even death. The American government stepped in as an attempt to diplomatically mediate these raging debates. They called for a meeting where tribes would meet with settlers to discuss the events in hopes of creating a peaceful resolution. A specific count of which tribes made up the tribal council is inconsistently reported through history, although it is known that at least 10 bands of Sioux and the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples were present. Due to the large number of tribes that arrived, they were forced to relocate this meeting from its original place in Fort Laramie, Wyoming, to Horse Creek, which is why the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1851 is also commonly known as the Horse Creek Treaty. Here, the American government and the indigenous tribes both agreed to keep peace with each other by holding each other accountable to specific agreements. Tribes had to allow travelers, railroad surveyors, and construction workers to enter tribal lands safely, allow the government to establish posts and roads, pay for any wrongdoing of their people, elect head chiefs to deal with the U.S. government agents, and cease fighting with other tribes. The U.S. government agreed to protect Indians from U.S. citizens, and because they would reduce their land, the government promised to deliver annuities if the terms of the treaty were upheld. After the Horse Creek Treaty, this is the land that was owned by the indigenous tribes. This is the land that the government promised protection over. The American government also promised the indigenous tribes with $50,000 every year for 50 years in order to help reimburse them for all of the materials that they lost due to the acts of white settlement. And this was a huge success for the indigenous tribes, until the American government quickly failed to keep its promise of reimbursing the tribes with money after only just a few payments, and questions about how reliable this treaty actually was began to rise. One thing that was not taken into consideration was the lack of translation at the council meeting. There were not enough representatives to translate the treaty into all languages of the tribes. The treaty was also written in English, although it was designated for the indigenous tribes' reference. Some believe that the lack of good translation for the tribes created an incomplete understanding for some of the indigenous people, These failed promises led to even more tensions and battles between the American government and Native tribes, one of which was the Sand Creek Massacre on November 29, 1864. When gold was now discovered in Colorado, it sent a group of new settlers traveling in heavily populated groups, and all whom ignored the words of the treaty and began harassing and invading the tribes in their newly assigned territories. These indigenous tribes naturally fought back with the settlers in response to this horrific act. The Colorado government tried to meet diplomatically with the leaders, again, from the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes, to further discuss a new peace treaty that would look at land territory and ownership. And although many natives did not accept this new agreement called the Treaty of Fort Wise, Colorado's government still passed it, reducing the amount of land available to the Cheyenne and Arapaho again. Black Kettle, a leader and representative for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, agreed to move his people down to Fort Lyon, Colorado, where they were promised hunting grounds near Sand Creek. As they were obeying this new peace treaty, a new plan of attack came from the American government. Secretly, Governor Evans from Colorado and a commander from the U.S. Army troops, John Chivington, and his soldiers, followed the tribe to their new territory and brutally massacred Black Kettle's tribes. On November 29, 1864, they killed the indigenous people and scalped them for money and then left behind their dead bodies. Only 9 of Chivington's men were killed. 148 of Black Kettle's followers were slaughtered. More than half of them were innocent women and children.
These things, that have come, it changed us. It changed the way the way people think, because they brought a construct thinking to hold you back, to blame you, to shame you, to do all of these things that made you feel terrible about yourself, and took over and just, murdered a lot of thousands of innocent children because of the language we speak, because of the color of our skin, because we loved our hair.
This massacre was heavily overshadowed by the current state of America's Civil War. With the consequence of it, the news was being falsely delivered to make citizens of Colorado and those all over America believe that Chivington's actions were honorable and important to resolve the many American Indian debates occurring. It wasn't until many months later that the truth behind the massacre was released, and people began to realize how truly dishonorable Chivington's actions were. This was just the beginning of the assimilation and cultural ruination towards the indigenous people.
I mean, at this point, the United States is explicitly a genocidal power at this point. Like, that's what the United States wants to do. It wants to, the way the United States wants to get rid of its so-called Indian problem is by managing Indians as cheaply as possible until they disappear.
This forced relocation, assimilation, and debate continued. The Colorado government and regions all over the U.S. made the continued attempt to remove indigenous people from their land as white population began to grow. Native peoples were forced to live in urban areas or were assimilated into the American culture by being sent to boarding schools where young children were taught out of their cultural ways.
The boarding schools have did a tremendous amount of damage on the minds and on the hearts of our children at that time. And so when they came home, some of the survivors came home, and it's sad to say that they're survivors from a boarding school, and it's crazy. But when they came back, they were so traumatized that they didn't even want to speak their language, and then so they didn't teach their children the language, because of that.
Much of their culture was lost due to the lack of indigenous traditions exposed to indigenous youth. The failed government's promise of peace and protection still persists through history and present-day America. Their forced relocation has impacted their livelihoods in more ways than just one.
We're adaptable people, and that makes us very intelligent to that growth and that evolving, because everything that has been that we've been through, we overcame them and adapted.